Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Ukrainian and Canadian Studies at the University of Manitoba. My name is Yulia Ivanuk, and I'm the coordinator of the center. Our today's speaker is Dr. Aleksandra Pomiecko. She works as a contract researcher at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and is a sessional instructor at the University of Manitoba. She has completed her PhD at the University of Toronto and previously her MA at Uniwersytet Jagiellonski in Krakow. Her research focuses on conflict and irregular war in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet space. The lecture, our today's lecture is about bandits and outlaws in the Polish-Soviet borderlands in 1918-1925. Please note that today's lecture will be video recorded and posted on our social media pages. If you have any questions, please leave a comment in the comment section, and we will call on you during the Q&A session in the end of it. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Pomiecko.
Thank you, Yulia, for a very nice introduction. And I also want to thank the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies for putting together these lecture series that allow people like myself to talk about our work. I think I will share my screen now because I do have a PowerPoint. There we go. Okay, I think everyone should see this now. So my presentation or my talk today is about banditry, outlaws, social outcasts, individuals that I've kind of been very interested in for research and kind of deviating and being distracted by other things that were at the time maybe more interesting or just a distraction. And what I started doing was collecting anecdotes, local stories, local newspaper clippings about sightings of bandits, about outlaw activity, and their representation in local media, primarily in areas of Western Belarus, so archives in Belarus, archives in Lithuania, and archives in Poland. And one of the first bandit characters that I came across that I immediately became really obsessed with was an individual by the name of Józef Mucha Michalski. And many of you will know that the word Mucha means a fly, so maybe this is sort of a combination of a pseudonym or something that he adopted along with Józef Michalski. We're not really sure. But in any case, I quickly sort of became an academic stalker and started collecting things specifically about Mucha. And one of the first descriptions of him in local media came from the newspaper Wileńskie Słowo in 1922 that described Mucha in this way. And now I'm going to quote from this paper, from this excerpt from the paper. Even the police cannot catch him because in Galicia, they are not taught how to catch this Eskimo from the Lithuanian forest. Perhaps it is because they only use sticky paper, which usually works for a variety of flies that fly around in a room. But this particular fly is not like that. In the meantime, Mucha is healthy and merry all throughout the Kresy, or borderland region, and continues to gain popularity in his Białowieża nest, end quote. Now, I would be remiss not to talk a little bit about language and terminology that appears in this particular excerpt, in other excerpts also, and of course in the title of my talk. And I want to talk about this term, quote unquote, Eskimo, that's used in this specific context, and I use it in this context in the 1920s, specifically to Mucha. It's a term that local newspapers used to talk about him specifically, to highlight and denote that he was a foreigner from the Lithuanian forest, to talk about how he was able to evade local authorities, the police, the state, and to talk about how he was so likable among locals. So this term is specifically used in this context to talk about Mucha in the 1920s in the Polish-Soviet borderlands. So once I started collecting more stories and more anecdotes of these bandits, Mucha and many, many others, I started to really take a step back and think about where this category of banditry, or how this category of banditry fits in within our understanding of the post-First World War order, the post-war period, and the 1920s in this borderland region, right? So I started to think about scholarship and what scholarship tends to focus, and sort of the context that allowed banditry to not only develop, but also really, really flourish in the 1920s. So I just want to provide a little bit of context. I know some of this will probably be very familiar to you, but in any case, we have two maps here, one on the left, noting Europe before the First World War, and of course, Europe in the aftermath of the First World War in the map on the right. We see that there are clear visible changes. You have several empires in existence prior to the First World War, and then afterwards, the collapse of the German, Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian empires. And for the context of the region that I'm studying, the collapse of the Russian Empire and Austro-Hungarian empires were very critical and important. These revolutionary processes, the subsequent border wars between the Central European state and just sort of the larger European civil war, as some scholars talk about, perpetuated this continuity of violence, of instability, of chaos that was really, really felt at the local level. And so this particular region that I'm focused on were the former sort of four more eastern provinces of the Second Polish Republic that was in existence between 1918 and 1939. The archival sources and literature that I use mainly come from the former regions of Wilno, Nowogródek, Polesie, and Wołyń or Volhynia. And so this is where I'm sort of focusing my study and my talk on. The region is now part of present-day Lithuania, Western Belarus, Ukraine a little bit too. And at the time, especially at the time and before the First World War and Second World War, it was a very, very diverse region, a diverse population with different religious, ethnic, linguistic, ethno-national groups. And so with the revolutionary processes, with the end of the First World War, all of this sort of exacerbated the variety of peoples living on this land. Armies traversing sort of back and forth between this land often adopted scorched earth policies, meant they burned everything on their way, leaving the land pretty barren and devastated, which is very important because most of those people living in these territories were peasants, so they relied on the land to survive. The lack of consistent currency, the spread of diseases, the lack of basic provisions to survive continued well on after the First World War ended. And of course, the violence, the series of armed conflicts, border wars, the movement of rogue bands, partisans, paramilitaries, also sort of continued and perpetuated this violence at the local level. And of course, the influx, or I should say the movement of people back and forth, the refugees, and the return of refugees trying to find what the status of their homes and livelihoods were. Also, of course, is the lack of rule and law. Because these are territories, because they were territories that were so distant from Warsaw or Minsk or Moscow, there was really a power vacuum, or I should say power vacuums all through this region, leading to the rise of paramilitary leaders, or perhaps more notorious bandits who, for a limited time at least, took on some power and ruled some pocket of territory in this region. This continued sort of well into the 1920s. Even with the signing of the official treaties, whether it be Versailles or the Treaty of Riga in 1921, in March of 1921, you still have a lot of instability that continues in Poland or the Second Polish Republic well until the mid-1920s, 1925, 1926. And there are a few reasons for this. It obviously takes a while for a new state or a re-emerging state to stabilize its territory, to secure its borders. And so this process took quite a bit of time for Polish authorities to get a handle on. The other thing that's really important is, of course, the minority composition in Poland at this time. 25% of the population in Poland at this time was composed of non-ethnic Poles. And most of this minority population was concentrated precisely in these eastern provinces. So you have a large population in these 4 provinces of Belarusians, Ukrainians, Jews, to a lesser extent, Lithuanians and Russians as well. And so they were mainly concentrated in these eastern provinces of Poland. Now, one of the policies that the Polish state adopts is essentially to privilege ethnic Poles over non-ethnic Poles. Not ethnic Poles, especially veterans of the First World War, or Pilsudski's legion specifically too, were given land, as opposed to non-ethnic Poles. And so you see this discrepancy very, very visible precisely in these regions where land was so important to one's survival and to one's livelihood. Of these 4 regions here in the eastern part of Poland, only between 14 and 50% of the population, depending on the region, was ethnic Polish. So the majority, in most cases, of the populations of these regions was not ethnically Polish, yet 85% of the land owned in these regions was owned by ethnic Poles. So there's a huge discrepancy there, and it becomes very, very visible. Not surprisingly, the only kind of jobs that non-ethnic Poles, such as Ukrainians or Belarusians, could get was working for the Polish pans, or the Polish landlords, right? So this becomes very visible. And this is not something that's just noted from the local perspective, but Polish authorities also noted these sort of discrepancy. In a report from November 1924, sent to the Ministry of Military Affairs, this Polish official noted that peasants were very upset about the distribution of land and were upset about police harassment. And this is a quote from the report. "The attitude of the police towards the peasants is very damaging. Ukrainian peasants are constantly abused by the police and are unable to find help nor swift settlement of their requests and belongings, as a result of which they are happier to turn to subversive bands. Peasants are also certain that the military is only used to help the wealthier landlords," or panom, that's the word used, end quote. Another testimony I found in the archive of the East in Warsaw came from a Polish man named Sławoj Kucharski, who was giving this testimony after the Second World War, but talking kind of about his life in interwar Poland. And this is what he says about what he remembers. And again, I'm quoting here from his testimony. "I perfectly remember the realities of the pre-war period, previous to the Second World War. Namely, the villages with Belarusians were very neglected. The area of Zdjęciu, today Diatlawa in Belarus, was a poor Orthodox village. The Belarusians working in the forest did not even use matches, but flint. They arranged the tinder on the flint and hit it with a stone, and when the spark fell from the flint to the tinder, it began to smolder. Then they would put a cigarette to the fire and it would light up. They did the same when lighting a bonfire. I knew these were places where one had to be very careful, because even murders took place here. We heard about the killing of a policeman and some bailiffs who wanted to take something from the peasants and put them in auction. These were villages on the Stara River. They were Belarusian villages," end quote. And so in this type of context, with the shortcomings and realities resulting from the First World War, but also further sort of propelled and enabled because of the conditions of the Polish state, in these sort of contexts, banditry not only emerged, but it flourished, especially into the 1920s. So when I talk about bandits, who am I talking about? I'm referring to, and I'm kind of borrowing from Eric Hobsbawm's definition and work on banditry. And when I'm talking about bandits, it's really about individuals who are perceived to be criminals and outlaws by the state or by wealthier landowners, in this case, Poles. So institutions and Poles seeing them as criminals, but individuals who remain really embedded with the peasant society and who the peasants and locals see as heroes, as avengers, as fighters of justice and perhaps in some cases liberation. These are people that were really admired and looked up to as the Robin Hoods of their society. Many of these bandits, or outlaws, were former soldiers. So here I just have a little bit of some examples of some calls and advertisements to soldiers who either were deserters, and so trying to forbid or dissuade people from becoming deserters, dissuade people from joining certain armed groups, depending. And so you see this written in a variety of languages and things that would have appeared sort of in this borderland region. So many of these individuals were peasants, had been conscripted to different armies, perhaps the Imperial Russian Army, or were later fighting for the Red Army or Polish Army. So they were experienced militarily. They were conditioned by the war, so quite used to sort of the everyday practices of violence and conflict. And more likely than not, they probably still had their guns and weapons on them, right? So many of these later bandits were young men, not surprisingly, although you do see some older individuals in their 50s and 60s participating in bandit activity. Many soldiers initially did not intend to be bandits, but they returned home and there were just no job opportunities for them. So they resorted to these sort of petty crimes in order to survive. And again, this is as a result of the war, but also the state just not providing sufficient opportunities or jobs, especially for non-ethnic Poles. Many bandits operated on a seasonal schedule, meaning they operated more in the summer months when it was warmer, and then when it was sort of winter or cold, they kind of retreated to their homes, likely. And you can see this in sort of the cases of bandit activity. There's a significantly decreased number of registered cases of bandit activity in, let's say, December to April, something like this. Some motivations of bandits. They were obviously because of the lack of the state resources, but also the lack of the ability of the state to apprehend individuals was also a motivation for people to engage in outlaw activity. And you see this because there are reports of a crime being committed by a group of individuals, and then they're found, taking naps in the forest or returning to their families. So clearly not worried that they're going to be, followed or apprehended by any police or state officials. And this had to do because of the lack of efficient state authorities in these remote quote unquote borderland areas. And it had to do with the fact that many of these bandits returned to places that they knew. So they were very familiar with, the forests, the marshes, the towns, the villages, much more than any, authority from Warsaw or from any nearby city coming into this region. Activity, according to the Polish state, activity classified as banditry included theft, armed robbery, destruction of property, home invasions, and in some cases murder, but murder was usually, a result of some other crime sort of in process. The peak of bandit activity in these four regions occurred between 1922 and 1923, where you have as many as 1,400 registered cases of crimes, of bandit-related crimes. And the most common crimes in this part of Poland included home invasions, robberies in homes, but also on trains. That was super popular. And of course, sometimes murder of local officials or politicians. The primary targets of such attacks, not surprisingly, were Poles, wealthier Poles who had land, who had estates, but also local institutions, state institutions, so post offices, banks, police stations. These were also really, really big targets for bandit attacks. Bandit attacks could include or involve as little as 5 people and as many as 100 people. And I've seen, instances of both. When it gets higher in number, that's when the attacks are sort of or targeted at multiple places in the town. So you do see people attacking the post office, the bank, the train station, and then some homes kind of simultaneously. For a bandit to be successful and to have a decent lifespan, let's say, there were a few things that could make that person survive. And one thing that was really, really useful was obviously having different language skills, but especially to have Polish language skills, to be able to tell your victims, hand over, your possessions right away. So that was really important. So successful bandits or bandit groups usually had at least one individual that could speak Polish. That was the case of Mucha, who I'll talk about a little bit later on. Understanding local geography was also really important because it was important for you to be aware of your surroundings and have a leg up over other sort of troops or police coming in from somewhere else. And so these were really, really important things. Now, for many, in much scholarship and work, there is an illusion or a perception that bandits are somehow seen or are treated as social outcasts, that they're sort of ostracized from society. That's not really the case here. You see that outlaws are really, really embedded within their towns and their local society. The lifespan of bandits really, really depended on how much aid and help they could get from family members, other relatives, locals, but even state authorities at the local level. Good relations with locals for outlaws ensured that they would have food, that they would have shelter. Sometimes the shelter was directly in someone's home of a local resident. I've seen cases where residents sort of build a shelter bunker just outside the town, and it's just kind of known to outlaws that they're welcome to stop by there and they're going to have food and they're going to have shelter, and it will be kept sort of between them. At the same time, this made it really difficult for the state to apprehend some bandits. And so in some cases, you have local authorities arresting the wrong person. You have local authorities arresting everyone in the household who would be associated with helping and abetting bandits. And this included women too. You have, in some cases, I've seen where it's announced that police is going to come to look for a particular bandit in a town. All the men of the town, regardless or not if they're involved in bandit activity, they all sort of leave the town because they're afraid they're going to be arrested too. So this sort of identification issue becomes really, really problematic because of how close these outlaws and locals were. There are cases such as in the town of Moroch, where an investigator reported that local authorities were making a little money on the side with local bandits by trading vodka to make some extra cash. There's a case of also a very popular and sort of infamous bandit. His name was Bolesław Żeleński. His pseudonym was Michał Hajdukiewicz. And here you see the Hajduk sort of relating to an ataman or leader of the partisans bandit, kind of a word added to his pseudonym. In any case, Żeleński had a very interesting story. In 1920, he joined men in neighboring towns who were also former soldiers like him who couldn't get back to their units. They got together and they started stealing horses and other livestock and selling them in other towns to make some money because there were just no job opportunities for him. Żeleński spent a lot of time hiding in the forest, and his mother would very frequently bring him food for him and his other sort of co-conspirators. He was apprehended several times by the police, but he was always let go by bribing local police officers who he knew personally because they happened to be childhood friends or childhood acquaintances. And usually for his release, he paid monetarily, but also with moonshine or some sort of vodka. In many cases, it was reported that local officials who knew him would even fire a few shots in the air to warn him that they were coming to officially look for him on his mother's estate. And Żeleński even had a good relationship with the mayor, with the son of this mayor, the son who agreed to forge some letters in his father's handwriting so that Zielinski could get new identity documents whenever he needed them. So here you see a really, really interesting relationship, a very intimate relationship with, officials and the state, local officials and Bandit, and sort of this cohabitation that's going on here. The other aspect to banditry in this region, The other aspect to banditry in this region is the element of the border, of course, and the Soviet state and the Polish state to some extent too. So what I mean by that is that the Soviet state was very interested in fueling banditry on the Polish side of the border. Why? Because they wanted to destabilize the borderland region. It was to their advantage. And so this played out in a way that outlaws committing a crime, this is for you guys on this side, so outlaws committing a crime, let's say in Poland, could easily flee to the Soviet border, cross the Soviet border, and not be apprehended by Soviet authorities. In many cases, from state documents I've seen, there'll be reports by Polish officials who are chasing a bandit. They get to the border, and they ask, the Soviet border patrol, well, why didn't you stop this individual? And they kind of turn their head and say, oh, well, we didn't see anyone. This is very, this is conscientious. This was on purpose. There were also many reports and some evidence to suggest that the Soviets during these winter months were kind of kidnapping or coercing disemployed men from Poland to come into Soviet Belarus and to be trained and to be sent back to Poland to engage in anti-Polish activity. And so there's a lot of reports about this kind of training going on. Of course, Polish documents overemphasize this, like there's an imminent war coming because this is happening. It wasn't happening to that sort of serious of an extent. But it's also worthy to note that the Poles were kind of doing the same when it happened to be people crossing into Soviet Belarus to engage in anti-Soviet activity. So this is happening on both sides. But it's happening, from what I gather from the sources, more on the Soviet side than it is on the Polish side. This is just a document from the Archiwum Akt Nowych archive in Warsaw with sort of the nitty-gritty handwriting of the new border that was agreed upon in 1921. And so it's no coincidence that you see these border towns, they were the ones that were affected most by this bandit activity. And there are many reports and things in the local media talking about how towns were completely wiped out by roving bandits and outlaws. Another individual, just to talk a little bit about this Soviet influence, a bandit later apprehended by Polish authorities, Piotr Joda, talks about the fact that he was coerced into going into Soviet Belarus because he was promised a job. He was placed in sort of a camp and learned how to shoot a gun and use ammunition and all this sort of stuff. And then he was able to return to Poland and then there get the weapons and ammunition necessary to engage in outlaw activity. They usually did not cross the border from Soviet Belarus into Poland with the guns on them and ammunition because they could get caught. Usually they were sort of hidden caches somewhere in the Polish side for them to then get their guns and weapons. So the other thing that I think is really interesting is, of course, the depiction of bandits and outlaws in local media. They were essentially local heroes, especially because of their actions against the state, because of their sort of redemption for actions for the state not taking care of locals. And so in many times, in the eyes of the locals, the state becomes a villain or sort of the laughing stock, and outlaws or bandits become these Robin Hoods, these figures to be looked up to. So I'll just highlight some stories that I think are really telling of this perception on behalf of the locals. The paper Wileńskoje Utro in February 1922 noted that a group of bandits assassinated a local politician after which they were found drinking some milk on the side of the road and smoking cigarettes. And the whole piece is talking about how they're drinking milk, what kind of cigarettes they're smoking, all this kind of stuff, really, really downplaying this assassination. Other reports in local papers often fixate on the inefficiency of local authorities to maintain order and to deal with these crimes that bandits are committing. They talk about, these papers talk about how long it takes for the police to arrive at the crime scene, how poorly the police does a job of investigating a crime. A newspaper from Pomiecko noted that bandits raiding a train often forced the wealthier citizens to sort of strip their clothes, and so they were just left in their undergarments and waiting for the police for 5-6 hours until they could arrive at the scene of the crime. And so you see a lot of criticism of the state for its inability to deal with this bandit activity, all the while glorifying or being amused by what the bandits themselves are doing. I kind of want to end with the local representation and perception of Mucha, of Józef Mucha Michalski. He received quite a lot of attention in the press, and reports of his sighting popped up all over. One day he was, in Vilno, the next day he was in Galicia, probably very unlikely considering now that's over a 10-hour car ride and you're talking about the 1920s, but multiple sightings of this Józef Mucha Michalski all over this Kresy or borderland region. Reports stress the fact that he often stole from the wealthy, gave to the poor, and he redistributed this money to his local town, but also other local towns that he would engage in bandit activity. In one alleged story, Mucha and his men successfully raided a town, but before they could leave, they were scolded by a local priest who told them, why are you doing this? And kind of was reprimanding Mucha and his men for attacking the town. So Mucha ordered, and this is allegedly, of course, Mucha ordered the men to put a backpack on the priest, and then Mucha told the priest that he better not move because the backpack is filled with grenades. So the priest kind of sat there or stood there for hours and hours until someone from his congregation found him. And when they finally opened the backpack, it was found to be filled with potatoes, not grenades. And the article stresses, of course, not the fact that, Mucha did this or his men did this to the poor priest, but that it was unfortunate that the poor priest had to wait so many hours for someone to find him. And so stressing sort of the comedic aspect of this, not the acts that bandits are doing. Another depiction of Mucha comes from Rzeczpospolita, who describes this scene that Mucha was again allegedly involved in. And I'm quoting, "He usually travels with a group of 10 to 12 men and skirts around the border area. All of his ambushes are similar in nature. He catches a party of people just about ready to sit down for dinner. But before they can eat, Mucha enters the dining room. He asks the individuals to sit and to remain calm and unafraid, for he does not intend to cause anyone any harm. Since many of these people are usually women, the well-mannered Mucha introduces himself with a graceful smile. Once he takes the adequate amount of money and valuables, he then asks for a friendly cup of tea, after which he kisses his host's hands and thanks them with a bow. Soon after, the well-behaved young man disappears, eluding the police. 2 weeks later, he appears where they least expect him," end quote. So what was really worrying for state officials was Mucha's likability by locals. And one official report noted that, I quote, the fact that a major thief who grew up among peasants does not have any peasant qualities makes him more likable to the inhabitants of Augustino, Nadniomansk, Białystok, Różansk, Palawierza, Naliboki, and Paliesk. He plays with our authorities, jokes with the police, behaves like a gentleman, and from time to time, he lunches at the Warszawianka in Wilno. All of this increases his influence among peasants, end quote. So, of course, it would be really difficult to actually verify all of Mucha's acts during his tenure as a bandit. And it's very likely that other individuals committed crimes and sort of ascribed the responsibility for that to Mucha, either to dissolve themselves of responsibility or to make perhaps Mucha more notorious than what he actually was. That we don't know. However, it's sort of the local descriptions of him and representations of him that I find to be really, really interesting, because it really reveals a lot about how locals are thinking and how they're reacting to the realities of what's happening to them in the post-war period. So just in conclusion, I think it's for this reason and for other reasons, it's really fascinating and important to look at banditry as a vehicle of analysis, to get a sense of the continuous struggle and conflict that happens even after the official diplomatic conclusions of war, to get a sense of what locals are experiencing, what they're thinking. And one of the best ways to do this is through local newspapers, because most locals were unable to write. And so in that way, that's kind of representative, perhaps in some ways, of those perceptions. And the relationship between bandits, locals, and the state is really, I think, important as well. And I see locals really using bandits and these acts as a form of comic relief, to make sense maybe, or to sort of use as some reprieve in their daily life. As far as sort of the end of bandit activity, it really culminated or really ended in the mid-1920s as the Polish state became better capable of apprehending these individuals, at stabilizing the border. And so banditry, to the extent that it was in the early 1920s, really goes down later on in the decade. As for Mucha, his story really seems to end as mysteriously as it began. In the local archive of Maladieczna, I found a record of an individual claiming to be Mucha, who was arrested with another bandit. And though there is an arrest, a death certificate for the other bandit, there isn't one for the person allegedly to be Mucha. And the last sort of archival footprint that I found about Mucha comes in on November 4th, 1923, after an armed robbery in which he and his men are involved in. There is a huge combined police effort in the areas of Baranovici, Niezwisz, and this police effort manages to follow, track, and apprehend many of the individuals in his crew. Not surprisingly, Mucha is not the one that's captured, and the report notes that he likely escaped, crossed the Soviet border and escaped there. So whereas we're not sure, about the actual individual, where his story and activity actually ends, legends of him and his activity certainly continued for many years after that in the local media, but also through oral histories. So I will stop here, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much for your analysis, Aleksandra. And I think we have our first question. What role did church leaders, religious organizations, and local parishes play during this period of banditry? Thank you.
That's a really good question. So the way I could answer that is just through the stories that I've seen and sort of seeing how, in this case, the poor priest that was sort of forced to stand in for hours, thinking he was carrying a backpack of grenades. Typically, there wasn't much criticism from what I've seen from the church. Now, of course, I doubt that this would have been condoned, that this kind of activity would have officially been condoned, but I have not seen any statement from local parishes or priests or members of the church criticizing this kind of activity. And so that's all I could really say about that, but it's a very interesting question and something that maybe I will start looking into more if and when those kind of sources come up. Thank you.
Does anyone in the audience have other questions? I'll give everyone an opportunity to think, and I'll ask a question myself. So what were the benefits of the local governments working with the bandits? Do you think that in some way they were anticipating that a larger conflict might be coming in the area, and they were trying to think ahead and establish good relationship with them?
Yeah, that's also a really good question, and one I have thought about a little bit. I think, and maybe I should have sort of made this more clear, I think there's a very big difference between local authorities and, of course, authorities coming from bigger cities. And I think with the local authorities, there was an inclination to have more sympathy towards bandits, especially if they were individuals that maybe they served together with during the war, or individuals that they knew from childhood. When you see a serious reaction or effort on behalf of the state to take a bandit act seriously, they usually send people from other bigger cities. They don't usually rely on local authorities to sort this stuff out. So my perception of that would be that these local authorities were certainly also trying to survive. They're probably not making that much money. And so if you're selling, a few bottles of vodka here or there to make some extra cash, who is that going to hurt, right? If you're not going to kill yourself trying to apprehend a bandit if maybe you don't feel like it, or you don't feel like the need to put your life at risk to do that. So I think this is kind of maybe the practicality, just the experience of everyday life. As far as like an imminent war coming, I think this is something, or what I've seen in the sources, this is something that's really hyped up from Warsaw. And this is someone in Warsaw sending a special committee, a member of the Korpus Ochrony Pogranicznej, the border patrol from Warsaw, sending them there, who's reporting on Soviet activity and what's happening. It's not a fear that people at the local level seem to have. Local people just kind of see bandits coming back and forth, and for them, everyone's kind of the same, unless they come from that particular village. So people from the local town are more important. Everyone else is kind of an outsider, whether you come from Soviet Belarus or whether you come from Warsaw. So this is kind of a little bit of identity sort of politics also play in a lot with this stuff.
Thank you. It's very interesting to learn about the local versus the national and more international perspectives on the topic. The next one I can see Nisrin would like to ask a question, so please go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, so this was an excellent presentation, and it's related to the previous question you just answered, but I'm interested in how the state saw this banditry in the center in Warsaw as it probably preventing the build of the state, right? Like this is preventing the actual construction of stable borders then in a way, right? Just because the examples you put up were, I'm assuming from local newspapers. So I'm wondering how like official newspapers are responding to this. What are they saying about how this affects the new Polish state?
Yeah, also, I think like you said, it follows up from the previous one. So the state documents that I use, or official archival documents that I use, are from regional places now found in Warsaw. But anyway, the state definitely sees these acts as a threat to the security of this really, really weak emerging Polish state. It also sees these acts as anti-Polish, as unpatriotic, as a threat to this homogeneity, Polish homogeneity that Poland is trying to aspire to be at this time, even though, of course, it agreed to take these minority populations into its country in the Treaty of Riga. So it definitely sees it as a threat. I would say, though, it really diminishes the agency of these local bandits, and it really overemphasizes the role of the Soviet state. People in Warsaw, authorities in Warsaw, really see these bandits as pawns of the Bolsheviks. Not even, as people residing in Poland, but people sort of sent from afar. And that's not unusual, of course, in just to this area of the world. So it really diminishes, the agency of these local actors, of local authorities, of bandits, and really sees this as something completely orchestrated by the Soviet state. And as a result, extremely threatening to the security of Poland, its borders, and this homogeneic Polish nation that they're trying to create.
Thank you so much once again for your analysis on this question. And you've briefly touched upon the relationship to Bolshevism and what was happening in Russia at that point of time. And Marilyn would like to know, how did the Russian Revolution impact the bandits and the politics in the region as well?
Yeah, so I think, again, really interesting question. I think probably on two levels, depending on who the bandits were. So on an ideological level, most bandits were not ideologically motivated, I think, unless they were members of a partisan group that then had some sort of agenda or mission or something planned that was directly, anti-Soviet or anti-Bolshevik or anti-Polish or something like that. And you do have partisan groups active in the region that are part of this, that are very ideologically motivated. And so the Russian Revolution, for that reason, or the revolutions for that reason, play a role in sort of fostering that. So if they were anti-Polish partisans that really were against Poland, they were motivated ideologically by these revolutionary processes. More broadly, though, thinking about the revolution and its impact on everyday life or society, I think in that sort of way, the revolution affected or was part of these processes of disruption, of destruction, of instability that really married with the war and the border wars and the conflict and all this stuff. So in this way, I think that's how the revolution weaves itself into that. And in this way, then obviously, it had a huge impact on the ability of bandits to find their homes, to find their places in this post-war world, to reside in a new state, to maybe, families torn apart, all this sort of stuff. So I think there's sort of two levels to that effect of the revolution, both of which are really important.
Well, thank you so much for answering this question. Our next question is from Ostav. Did the bandits adopt a political and national position, let's say anti-Polish state, and did they see this as a continuation of the struggles that occurred in the end of the World War I? Thank you.
Yeah, so I will just continue a little bit from what I think I just said. Yeah, there were certainly more motivated individuals. I wouldn't call them bandits. I think for me, and you guys can certainly disagree, and people have disagreed with me about this, there were differences, I think, between people that were ideologically motivated and people that were motivated because of material needs or gains. And I see bandits, if there's any ideology driving that, I really think it's kind of like an anti-state, anti-authoritarian, not anti-authoritarian, anti-state sort of sentiment. As far as something catered more specifically to a national group or to a state, then I really see those individuals as being part of a partisan movement, not partisan in the context of the Second World War, partisan like just ideologically more organized armed groups. Or, for example, warlords. So Bułak Bałachowicz, this very famous, notorious warlord who declared himself like the president of, or the leader of Belarus, even though his army was not even really Belarusian. He would be an example of maybe some of that reaction in the post-war era. But I don't see him as a bandit because he had, his currency, he put his face on the money, he had sort of, some sort of declaration that he wanted to make that was anti-Polish. So I see that really different as something that is more bandit oriented. But there were certainly many groups that sort of developed out of these processes, yeah.
that's definitely an extremely complex era. With all the little intricacies happening at the same time. Aleksandra, there's a Mucha family in Edmonton. Have you had a chance to research this aspect?
No, I have not. But if you could give me more information, if that's okay with the family, that would be very interesting to look into more. It is a popular, it is a somewhat popular name, but you never know. Maybe there's some connection to that.
Of any Eastern European criminal organizations that have drawn inspiration from Mucha's Robin Hood personality, and are there any clear examples of modern Eastern European criminals or groups that have succeeded in portraying a friendly or charming image to win over the people in the same way as Mucha did?
That's another very good question. I don't know of a criminal organization. I would have another good question. I have to go into that. However, as far as reusing Mucha's name, this certainly happened during the Second World War with Armia Krajowa, the Polish Home Army. There were many leaders who took on the name Mucha, representative of this bandit from the 1920s. And so there were many cells of the Polish Home Army with leaders who called themselves Mucha, sort of in code, that drew from him for sure. But as far as criminal organizations, I'm not aware of that, but I'll have to look into that. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer. Could you please also talk a little bit about how communist historiography, Soviet or Polish view and depict the bandits?
Yeah, this is also a very good question. So many individuals involved in bandit activity later, after in the mid-1920s, if they were, let's say, if the Soviet states saw them as having been anti-Polish in their orientation, they lived the rest of their lives in the 1920s, 1930s. Some of them even fought in the Second World War, the Great sort of Patriotic War, as it was called, and became very high-ranking generals because of their anti-Polish fighting in the 1920s. That was the fate sort of them. For individuals who were seen by the state to have been anti-Soviet in orientation, if they chose to live in the Soviet Union, were very likely apprehended by Soviet authorities in the 1930s, and either forced into exile or killed for their anti-Soviet activity. As far as perceptions of the Soviet state, similar to the Polish, but any sort of partisan activity or bandit activity on the border was a propaganda effort and initiative of the Polish authorities, and not because people were anti-Soviet in orientation intrinsically. So that's kind of the Soviet perception of this. So it's similar to that of the Polish state, right? That they're giving the state much more power and very little agency to the actual motivations, or little agency to the bandits themselves or to the locals themselves. So that's kind of how that's seen. And of course, the ramifications for those that were involved in banditry were high in both cases. I mean, for being accused of helping and abetting a bandit could lead you 5 years in prison in Poland. So it's not like it was easy peasy over there. It was, different, but certainly the state was very quick to crack down on anyone that they thought was a bandit.
Thank you. Ivan has asked a question about the bandits' involvement in the existing paramilitary organizations that fought against the Polish regime, and in particular, Ukrainska Військова Організація, the Ukrainian military organization.
Again, something I don't know about, because it's a very good question, and it's one of those things where just because there isn't direct evidence doesn't mean that there was no involvement or overlap. I just don't know enough about the actual lives of these individuals to specifically say, this person had been involved in this paramilitary organization, or had been involved, in a pogrom in 1915, and then later joined a bandit group. That's the kind of the reality, is the sources don't let me specify if there are specific connections besides general ideas that, well, they were soldiers, so they hypothetically could have fought for paramilitaries or for different armies. But that's an interesting connection to be made. I know more about if they survived their post-war life, so if they fought in the Second World War afterwards or something like that, but not so much about before their bandit activity. But again, a very, very good question that I'll have to keep my eyes on if I see any sources.
Okay, I think we don't have any new questions coming up, and it's time for us to come to conclusion of this lecture. Thank you so much for your great analysis and your great presentation on the topic. And thank you to all those who have attended our presentation today. Just wanted to remind everyone that our next lecture will take place next week on Friday, and it will be a Ukrainian language on Ivan Ogienko, fundator Університетської освіти на Поділі. And I think one of the audience members still has a comment. So Nizreen, would you like to
Oh, I thought we were.
Say one last comment.
Fine. But I was just wondering about, because I think this is a fantastic project and seeing it in the long term, right? Going beyond just the early part of the century, but seeing how and when does this banditry end, and what does that mean about the development of state power in Poland, right? That when does banditry end? When does it become hard to do? And I was thinking about during your presentation, the idea of seeing like a state, right? The ways that state power was just all imposing and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think it's a good question, not only because we can talk about the end of banditry as sort of the solidification of the Polish state, right? Feeling secure in its borders, stabilizing, maybe able to provide for its citizens more, who then are less tempted to move to banditry. But the process of state, in this case, Poland, recreation, but other states in that region, creation and stabilization, just because you sign a treaty that says you can be a state now, doesn't mean that you actually practice and operate like one. And I think that examining banditry really reveals the weaknesses of a state at the local sort of dissident level. And you don't have to be a big, shot partisan or paramilitary to show that the state's having problems really grasping what its responsibilities are and how to proceed. So I think those two processes are very, very related and important. So yeah, thank you for that question and that comment.
Now that everyone has had a chance to ask all of their questions and they're answered, so I'd like to wrap up our session and thank everyone for attending. And also just a small reminder, the center is on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and we also have a website. So if you're interested in following us and seeing all the future events, please follow us at the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies, and you'll be able to see all the events that are taking place, including the one next week. Thank you so much once again.